This game's looting system was so bad that it is genuinely the first time where I felt like a game was deliberately wasting my time and forced me to think about looting systems in games. Specifically about what makes a looting system good and why I couldn't enjoy the looting system in this game. It felt bad to me the entire time playing. My biggest complaint in the last video was that the game's combat was a slog to get through because of the lack of active gameplay elements or things that forced you to pay attention to it. I also mentioned that it felt unrewarding to engage in. The reason why I didn't enjoy the looting in this game was because it forced you to pay attention to it in order to make the gameplay less unbearable. When you spent hours going through environments, engaging in that boring combat, you often had nothing to show for it because the game's containers are empty and full of absolutely nothing most of the time. I don't mean that they didn't have anything for my character or my team, but that they often had literally nothing in them. This is where the unrewarding aspect of the game comes from for me. The game plays itself with you doing absolutely nothing but pressing a single action, and whether you do damage or not is determined by gear that feels rare or lucky to find rather than rewarding and earned. The looting system in this game lends itself to subsequent playthroughs rather than your first, and I think that's bad game design, since it requires you to do one of two things: look things up or slog through your first playthrough to earn the right to look things up. What elucidates this to me as a gameplay problem is the lack of randomization. The lack of randomization really makes the game's looting system bad for me. Playing Baldur's Gate 3 then going to Dragon's Dogma, where the chest placement in the world is deliberate, containing loot that is randomized, is just night and day in terms of an actually engaging system. Dragon's Dogma's system means that you should open every chest, and if you open every chest, you will always get something that is useful. While some of them are secretive to boot, not hidden behind another dice roll. With the crafting system present in Dragon's Dogma, you are always getting something that can either be made to cure status effects or heal you. Options deliberately placed by the devs. However, sometimes it's weapons, which means that it's possible to get good gear early or get okay gear later, but you are always going to open that chest because no matter what you got, you are going to use it. Because the different vocations in this game don't share gear. This means eventually you would have to use that gear that might have been useless earlier in your playthrough. The chests aren't so infrequent where you're constantly asking why you don't have any heals, but they're not so frequent that you're overlooking chests and not engaging in the game. The game forces you to engage in the systems because you need everything to survive due to how demanding the game is. And these chests respawn so you're not feeling like you got shorted when you come back to an area and get something good. However, there are still hand-placed gear in this game too, so you're not underpowered because you weren't finding all the secrets or getting unlucky. Baldur's Gate 3 system, in contrast, has you going through fights that aren't interesting, that aren't demanding anything other than time from you, and are often dominated by luck and your gear. All things I discussed in part 1. However, I recognize that gear was important early in the game, mainly because when my team was getting their builds, the stat increases from their gear, which directly translates to damage numbers, was astronomical compared to when they didn't have it. So naturally, I took to looting containers. This goes into randomized loot, how this game doesn't have it for gear, and why that's a problem. Every piece of gear is hand placed in this game, but the containers are not. So while it's possible to find lootable containers with potentially good gear, it is rare and not conducive to a fun looting experience because of how frequent empty containers pop up in this game. The very fact that this hand-placed gear can pop up in seemingly minor or unremarkable containers is what forces the player to loot. While there are a lot of containers in this game, many of them contain actually nothing or downright useless sellable items. So much so that at a certain point, I just stopped looting altogether when I felt like my build was good enough to get through the game because I just wanted it over. Largely due to how annoyed I was at having spending hours playing, looting, clearing entire mini dungeons or actual dungeons over and over and getting nothing to change my build for 60 plus hours. Every container opened while exploring that had nothing in it just added to my frustration and actively forced me to think about the looting system in this game, which is not what a good game would do. All while being gaslit by my party about how the looting was fine and it's okay to have your time wasted with empty containers or randomization because you wouldn't want an OP weapon found early, which doesn't make any sense because everything in this game is tied to a random dice roll that only gets in your favor the more you play the game, and the damage you do with weapons is also tied to your level. The base stats in this game just help boost the odds of your dice rolls in your favor. Weapons don't fundamentally change gameplay, so much so that I was finding common greatswords that were nearly as powerful as some of the legendary items in terms of damage despite scaling off of the same stats. Sometimes the containers have sellables, but I'm not kidding, 60 to 80% of the containers in this game are just actually empty. Many of the gear pieces I got were from shops. This and sellables will be its own section, but for now, so much of the world that you as a player have some agency to interact with is squandered because of this shortcoming. Some might mention the crafting system found in this game, and while I didn't engage in it, one of my teammates actually did. I can tell you that we rarely ever needed to use these crafted items. We had a shit ton of them by the end of the game, and many of them don't stack buffs on top of each other. The ones that were used were giving him more spell slots, but if we had to engage in the crafting system in order to progress through the game, then I'd also say that this is bad game design too. The only things in this game that are randomized are sellables, crafting materials, food, and potions. However, I mentioned earlier that the containers were actually just empty more often than not. So if we were required to frequently use potions that were specific to our class and force us to look for crafting materials, then the fact that most containers are empty would be more annoying than engaging. It would just be another thing that further restricts my capabilities as a player to alleviate the already unrewarding and unengaging systems in the game. The gameplay is mechanically empty and the world is functionally empty. I do not find it fun to go through a dungeon, slogging through fight after fight, outnumbered and having dice rolls play the game for me, only to get to the end and get absolutely nothing as a reward, or something that is basically nothing since the gear was as good as something I found in Act 1, which I'll get into later. This level of carelessness about player engagement comes seemingly from the devs wanting you to look things up, which is my only takeaway having thought about the systems that as they are and seeing how people play this game. Earlier I mentioned how the game is better on subsequent playthroughs. This was largely with the caveat that you have a form of honor to only look things up after you beat the game. Like playing a Soulsborne game and only figuring out how to get to a place after you beat the game. I suspect that many people playing these games generally just don't do that because I don't see how you can find the system fun when other games within the genre do it better. Using the wiki to build your character for you, min-maxing after you beat the game to feel how strong you could have been had you functionally cheated, is the only way that I can see you getting enjoyability out of this combat system, unless you don't care about the stop and stare gameplay. Using the wiki to find loot in this game feels like another layer of insult because it just takes away the main reason you even play an RPG to begin with: build variety and player expression within it. I mentioned and alluded to this in part 1, but this system forces the player to engage in a practice that makes the only unique thing about the game and RPG genre to be taken away. Either you slog through fights because you're underpowered since you didn't loot a container that had gloves that gave you +2 to concentration saving throws in a level with 40 empty crates, or you break any immersion by scrolling hours through the wiki and seeing where you get gloves that give you a boost to concentration saving throws or dexterity or strength. It's just unengaging and unrewarding. I only did this once 75 hours into my playthrough because I had completely given up on the looting system entirely, and my trust in the game was extremely low when it gave me the option to use a one-time spell for a potential legendary weapon, only to find out that the game doesn't even commit to this, since you can get a hireling, bring them to the level to get that spell, then never see that guy again after he fulfilled his purpose, just sitting in camp languishing away. He doesn't even show up in the final end screen where your entire party comes back, which I think is just funny. It's hard to really describe this phenomenon, mainly because I just went on about how the gear is extremely powerful in determining your enjoyment with the combat, but it's also surprisingly unimportant at the same time. At least the game feels like it wants gear to be unimportant, meaning that only some of the gear is actually useful. So after spending 100 hours combing through literally empty crates, generally 95% of the gear you find in this game is useless because it pertains to a different class entirely or all equal levels of shitty and don't change anything about your build that much. With the last 5% of insane build changing gear found in the lower city of Baldur's Gate in shops, which is the last 20 hours of the game. Then that becomes you absolutely breezing through fights as fast as the game allows you to, which is still slow. I don't think my party had to restart a fight for 15 hours until the final fight with the brain because of us underestimating a boss that has some form of dynamic level design. Meaning, we failed because we only sent one of our party members into the realm at the end of the game and we messed up. Then that became us using an invincibility spell to wail on the final boss to keep the platforms from collapsing. I do not know how you would do that fight without invincibility or engaging in the aforementioned crafting system to make flying potions, because that brain fight is just some bullshit with the way that the random platforms just break, and taking like 220 to 200 damage, and also taking psychic damage every single time you attack the boss. I genuinely just don't know how this is fun. If we had to engage in that fight for 6 hours instead of 30 minutes, restarting more than 4 times, then I'd be bringing that up, like Merkel, for a small section of gameplay commentary coming back into this video. Rings and necklaces are generally useless in this game, with only a couple ones for both equipment slots being useful. I had a necklace I got in the beginning of the game that was never swapped out for 80 hours until I got the Constitution necklace from the House of Hope. All that other necklace did was give me a free Misty Step, which is powerful, but the fact that for 80 hours I couldn't find a replacement while actively looking for one for 60 of those hours is just telling of how bad the loot is in this game. And this doesn't just go for me. The only person who actively changed their loot for most of the game was our wizard. Everyone else basically was wearing what they had gotten from Act 1 or 2 the entire playthrough. Our rogue didn't change his chest piece, one of the most fundamental build changing areas in the game in terms of loot, since the beginning of the game, and he never stopped doing good damage. I genuinely can only think of a couple pieces of gear that weren't better than a meh when you read it. A lot of the loot in this game gives you that meh feeling, but it is imperative that you find good gear in this game if you want to get through the boring fights at a reasonable manner and consistently not taking a shit ton of damage and dealing no damage. I think that rings should remain the same in the small, nearly unnoticeable buffs that they give you, but what would actually make them useful is if they're one of the only ways without wasting a feat to actually boost your core stats, which is the case in every other D&D setting, like Dark and Darker, and even fucking Baroni gets this right. Make them more common and have +3s, +2s, or +1s to different stats, or even armor class placed in shops throughout the game, and save the actually gameplay defining gear to be randomized so that every playthrough is unique while still being generally powerful at some stages of the game. You can lock certain gear behind axe, but so much of the good gear in this game is locked behind stealing it from already powerful people in the game. Not just beating a boss to get some often man loot, but actually stealing it from places. I don't find that fun when the stealing part is almost always a literal dice roll where the game wants you to roll 20s or breach the upper 20s to 30s in order to obtain this gear. That aspect of attaining that gear would be fine if it wasn't some of the most powerful and generally only useful gear in the game. I shit you not, I was wearing a ring for 50 hours that only allowed me to apply a light field to my weapon. Not a revealing light that shows invisible people, just a normal fucking light. It was legendary and I used it once and then never again. I was only able to replace it when a different party member found a ring that was better than the one that they were currently wearing, and I just started wearing their old one because it literally could not be worse than the one that I had on. That whole sidebar of equipment was utterly useless as a paladin and cleric for so long, and was only useful for my other party members because they knew what they wanted their builds to be going into this playthrough. This looting and gear system is only, and I hesitate to even call it this, good when you're not engaging in it and looking builds up, which is stripping away the last vestiges of the illusionary unique run you can have. Going through the game naturally is just not fun or rewarding. I do not understand how this game won Game of the Year. Some of the other ways to get good gear is by buying it from shops, but these shops are often located at the end of the game. Most of the shops before that sell gear that is just as useless as the gear you're barely finding out in the levels. But what's worse is that the game locks these shops behind acts. I just went on about how necklaces and rings are useless, but what if I missed something back in Act 1, and upon realizing that the shops in Baldur's Gate, the city, didn't have any rings or necklaces for me, I wanted to go back to check the shops in Act 1 or 2. But you can't. There genuinely is no reason why you can't. Without getting in the potential story reasons, every other RPG allows you to do this. Locking the main game world away because you're going to fight the final boss makes sense. You're ending the game. But even if I had to walk there, which wouldn't be fun and I definitely would complain about that, why can't I just go back and check shops from the previous acts? What if I didn't understand how important the gear system was until reaching Baldur's Gate? What if I wanted to experiment in dyeing my armor and didn't like the colors found in Baldur's Gate, but remembered a dye in Act 2 I might like? Or what if I didn't like the colors in Baldur's Gate and just wanted to see if there were other dyes in Act 1 or 2? What if something clicked in my head about a potential puzzle in Act 1 that only was solved in the back of my brain in Act 3? All this game does is restrict player freedom, and it's just so tiring. The decisions to restrict player choice in this game make absolutely no sense and only serve to be even more annoying. I spent 60 plus hours looking forward to Baldur's Gate, specifically because I did not like the looting, and I just assumed that there would be actually good necklaces, rings, different weapons, pieces of armor, and in there, and I got there, and there was literally 8 pieces of equipment for my entire team. Only half of those pieces were from shops. If all the equipment is simultaneously so important, but also equally shit in rarity at every stage of the game, then why deny me the ability to go back to a shop in a previous act? These shops might contain something better for Shadowheart or my paladin or the rest of my party members. Why am I being punished for not recognizing the importance of certain pieces of equipment earlier, when the party wouldn't have had that much money to buy it or waste to earn the gold to buy it, when it just could have been a long journey back with potentially harder enemies, newer foes, corrupted lands? I mean, one of the main bad guys is literally marching his army on the city as the way that they ended Act 2. So why couldn't we get to the city, go back, and realize, holy crap, the enemies are way harder now, despite us being stronger, if we wanted to go and try and find the shops before? Let's say that they're barely holding on, they're in flames or something. At least they would be there. I don't know. The game already has boring combat, the loot already fucking sucks to engage with, and the story plot-wise is not very complicated or thematically rich. Why restrict my freedoms even further by taking away the last bits of control where I can just go somewhere? The next video will be about the plot of the game. I think I've ranted about everything I had to say about looting in this game. Ultimately, I'm super disappointed in it and the game as a whole. I will repeat, I did not come into this game being as annoyed as I am now. I actually wanted to enjoy it, but the more I played the game, the more I realized it's just not a good RPG, and confirmed why I don't like turn-based games. These feelings only got worse when I went back to play Dragon's Dogma for footage in this series, and coming to the conclusion that it did everything better.